Would you like to accelerate your career and reach your full potential in just minutes a day? Welcome to the LEADx Show with New York Times bestselling author and Inc. 500 entrepreneur, Kevin Cruz.
Hey everyone, I'm Kevin Cruz. Welcome to the LEADx Leadership Show. And today we're doing one of those special, let's call it two blokes chatting about leadership. And my friend today is David Dye. Now, David is half of the dynamic duo that forms Let's Grow Leaders. His partner is Karen Hurt. And for longtime listeners, you know I'm a huge fan of the work that David and Karen are doing. Love their book called Winning Well. Love their articles. I follow a lot of people on social media, but I'm always reading their stuff. We just think alike, and they write and communicate way better than I do. David is, he's an author, of course. He's a keynote speaker. He's an executive coach. He's a consultant, and he's got tons of experience in management, leadership, and teaching others how to drive massive results in the workplace. You'll hear us kind of geeking out and doing some inside baseball stuff about how to write books. And boy, I think I know everything about writing books. And he schooled me on a couple of things that made me think, I've got some tips for my next book. So this stuff is gold. And before we start that interview, and it's a two-way. He'll interview me, I'll interview him. So it's going to be a longer show than normal. But before we get to that, remember, if you haven't already tried out the LEADx app, just go download it from the Apple iStore, the Android store, and try it out. You can play with it for free for I think it's 7 or 14 days. Tons of book summaries, tons of content. You get to meet Coach Amanda, pick a goal. She'll give you an action plan and make you better. LEADx.org or download the apps from the app stores. So enjoy this interview, this two-way conversation with myself and David Dye. Thanks. David, officially welcome to my LEADx Leadership Show. I know we're doing a combo conversation here.
All right, Kevin. Well, officially welcome to Leadership Without Losing Your Soul podcast. It's great to have you as well.
Now, this is a relatively new podcast for us leadership junkies, right?
That's right. In fact, we just started our second season. So people listening to your interview, it will be in season 2. Yeah.
Congratulations. I think there's a lot of people that want to become podcasters, or they do a couple episodes and say, wow, this is a lot harder than I thought. And the fact that you're on season 2, you're doing something right.
Well, and the reaction has been great. So it's been good to see people, owning it and liking it in a way that we had hoped would be the case. So that's always fulfilling as well.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I don't know if you guys have been following this, but people who listen to podcasts think everybody listens to podcasts, but it's still kind of a niche thing. But like Spotify has gotten big into podcasts. And I think as more people figure out I can listen on however I'm just listening to music and things, I think the audience is just going to get a lot bigger. Yeah,
it continues to spread. And so having that searchable content that is audio content, what a powerful platform. And it's an amazing world we live in.
Yeah. Thankfully for us. Now, David, I before this show went on, I did a quick bio, but in your own words, tell my audience a little bit about you. I just mentioned you're president of Let's Grow Leaders, co-author of Winning Well, but tell everyone about you.
Sure. Well, background, I actually started my professional career as a teacher. I was an educator in inner city schools in Denver, Colorado, and did some nonprofit and human service work. And quickly in that experience, the leadership development in that industry usually is not very much. And so I self-educated and very quickly got into leadership development and helping build the managerial skills, both for myself and then teams of managers, and then promoted up. And as an executive, helped replicate some of that organization around the country and did a lot of leadership development. And honestly, after 16 years looking through my own work, that was the thing I most enjoyed, was helping people become the best version of themselves and to be as effective as they could. And so several years back, went into business on my own and met Karen Hurt, my partner and co-author and wife at this point. Although it started purely business. We wrote a book together and fell in love in the process. And so that's a great story as well.
I can't imagine writing a book with someone and it ending with falling in love. Like I would think that could, people break up marriages over writing books together. Yours were, I'm surprised.
Well, I have a friend who's an author for many, many years. And as we were working on the co-authoring process, and I said, Karen's really got to be a good friend. And he was somewhat prophetic. He said, well, listen, you're going to co-author. There's only two paths. You're either going to hate the person by the end or you're going to love them. He didn't know how right he was.
Which I'm going to underscore for all of our listeners and say, anyone who's thinking about writing a book with a friend, be very, very careful who that friend is because there's only two outcomes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think he was right.
So tell us a little bit. Now, we had talked on an earlier episode about winning well, but it was way back. But tell me just a little bit about the book too.
Sure. So Winning Well, the subtitle is A Manager's Guide to Getting Results Without Losing Your Soul.
Yeah.
And it is a very practical approach to the day in, day out challenges and solutions that managers need in order to be effective and really achieve transformational and breakthrough results without sacrificing their humanity or losing your mind in the process. So that is, it's a soup to nuts. It's many people read it straight through, but other people just open the chapter, skim, and say, that's the tool I need today. Very practical, very much read it and apply it right away.
And I think people who follow my work, on LinkedIn, social media, or whatever, I've had, a lot of the bigger names than ours in leadership on, and I like to write, I like to read. I'm a real leadership junkie. But the work you guys do, your book, your blog posts, even your social media, like I think is the best in the business. Like I'm often like, oh, that's an interesting thing. Or just probably 3 days ago, I'm like, when we're not recording, I'll have to ask, like, how the heck do you guys have such great Twitter game? Because the content's great, your followers are high. Like you guys, like everybody should be following you guys because you're doing it better than most.
Well, I appreciate that. And that actually means a lot coming from you. Because I would tell anybody listening to this who isn't already following Kevin Cruz that if you're not, you're making a mistake for all the same reasons. But thank you for that. That's high praise and quite a compliment. But, ultimately it's leadership and the fundamentals of leadership that I know you and I are in alignment on. It's about serving and it's about helping and about helping people to grow and develop and on that journey. And so it's another aspect of that work.
So what do you guys see as, because you guys are doing keynotes, you guys are doing classes, like what is a core message or what do like first-time managers need to hear and know about leadership, do you think?
Oh, if you get really practical at the fundamental level, clear expectations, the 90% of the challenges that when we're working with frontline or new managers, 90% of the challenges that they're running into are they're frustrated with somebody, but that person's understanding of what's expected of them is not the same as their leader. And so just getting clarity around shared expectations and what success looks like and why what you're doing matters and why it's important. If you can do those things effectively day in, day out, everything else becomes easier.
Yeah. Yeah.
How would you answer that question? What from your?
Well, similarly, I mean, when I think about when I always say young and dumb and a bad first-time manager, I didn't realize the importance of being crystal clear on expectations. I didn't understand the importance of giving, effective feedback. And I had, like personality blockers. Like I continue to be like a people pleaser. It's really hard for me to have a crucial conversation or, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. And so, but I didn't know what I didn't know. I mean, I was doing startups from the beginning. I never went to a management training program or anything like that. So I agree that just some of those core fundamentals are key. And what's kind of funny, David, is so I've got 3 kids and my oldest, my 2 daughters, one's going into her senior year of college and is doing internships. The other one's a freshman and she's working in retail for the summer. And so now they're not in management, but I'm hearing they've entered the work world for the first time. So they come home and more often than not, teenagers are complaining about their managers. And I try to like what I hear, I can sense like, yeah, the managers are not doing certain things right. But I don't never put it on the manager. I say, okay, well, what can you do to change the situation or whatever?
Absolutely.
And a lot of it, my oldest just ended up leaving an internship that went bad. And it was working for someone who really just was not clear in terms of the daily or weekly expectations of the work. And they didn't have a cadence of communication. Mm-hmm. And it was a remote situation, which makes it tougher, right? And so, my daughter Amanda would be sending emails that would never get read, but then the manager would send text messages back. And I just feel like, oh, wow, I just wish I could grab the two of them and be like, down. Okay, like what is the body of work that needs to get created this week? What's the agreement on how often you will communicate and in what form?
Response time.
Right. I often say it's just like a service level agreement. It's like, what's our standards? What's our expectations on the team with each other? But again, this seems like obvious stuff to guys like us. It's not so obvious to a lot of first-time managers out there.
No, and I think part of the reason for that are actually even senior level leaders. I mean, we've done a lot of work with a lot of organizations, and we have a team communications checklist that we will work people through. And it is interesting how often people will answer the question, like a stoplight kind of analysis, green, yellow, red. How often people will answer the question, do we return emails and phone calls in a timely manner? And it gets a green or a yellow. Yeah, we kind of do. And then you ask them, well, what is a timely manner? And the answers range everywhere depending on the form of communication from 2 days to 2 hours and everything in between. And so just getting clarity around those kinds of things can help improve performance and trust and all the relationships that are necessary to get great results.
See, you just stumbled into gold already. Like I wrote it down. So do you make available on your website the team communication checklist or do you have a blog post about this kind of idea?
We sure do have that blog post, and I'll have to get you the URL and put it in the show notes afterwards. But yeah, it's one of the tools that's in our that we give everybody we work with, and it's certainly available via the blog post as well. So I'll share that.
And that's such a great insight. It's like, it's one thing for everyone to say, oh yeah, we get back to each other on a timely basis. And then you find out your idea is like within the hour, mine's within the week. And no wonder we've got emotion going on, And
it's normal because our sense of what makes sense to us. I always like to ask people, when was the last time you didn't make sense to you? And you hadn't been drinking. I think it's important to clarify that. But right. And so, Karen and I ran into this when we formed our partnership. She has a high response time, a very short response time. If she sends an email, she expects to hear back within 2 to 4 hours on most topics. And mine was more of a 24-hour cycle unless there was some urgency expressed in the message. So we had to have that conversation. If we had to have that conversation, everyone needs to have that conversation.
Yeah. And this gets at a couple of books ago, I wrote a book about productivity and time management. And that's often a fundamental thing where, I'm trying to preach, especially with email of like, look, it shouldn't be an always on quick response device because it's interrupting us. We can't do deep work. We can't think strategically, creatively. And then people will say, but my boss expects X minutes or whatever. And I say, first of all, is that an assumption or did they state it? And it's different if they've stated it. But then I always say, all right, well, if you have a decent enough relationship, just talk to your boss and say, listen, in order to fulfill your goals, I want to deep dive into some projects. And so I would like to open email and process it at 9 a.m., 12, 3, and 5. But then when I'm done, those windows, it's closed. Is this okay? Now, I've never heard anyone come back and say, oh, I got yelled at, or they said that's ridiculous, or whatever. When you say, in the spirit of productivity, a better productivity, here's the response times. And usually it's within hours instead of days. Everybody's like, oh, sure, I get it. No problem.
Everybody has that same challenge.
You could always say, email it. But if you need it in, faster than 3 hours or 4 hours, come knock on my door, pick up the phone and ring it, and then I'll answer.
Or text or whatever, or use Slack or whatever. There's so many different ways that we have. Yeah. You're absolutely right. It's such an important conversation to have. And I think I want to underscore what you just said is that don't assume. that's where we get ourselves in trouble. We assume because there was a reaction to something one time that's the way it is all the time. And that's not necessarily the case, especially when you frame it in terms of I'm trying to help and I want to be as productive as we can.
Yeah. No, makes sense. Hey, I want to, this is like a selfish question, but I know I get a lot of listeners who are themselves consultants, writers, solopreneurs and stuff. What have you guys found, like in the last year or so, has been an effective way to, grow your business, whether it's speaking gigs, consultants, like inside baseball? What's working these days?
Inside baseball. So, and I always am cautious when I share these things with anybody in this line of work is that your mileage may vary and you need to know your strategy before you choose a particular tactic. All that said, our number one strategy for business development is content marketing. So, you mentioned it earlier, the social media game, the blog post, all of it. We try to be helpful to people where they are in the moment, and that leads to work. It's not exclusively, it's not the only way we market, it's not the only way we do business development, but it is by far the leading way that we get work and that people say, hey, can you come and help our people, is because of that content.
Now, when it comes to content marketing, do you think it's more like search engine optimization? So they're looking for how to give feedback, I'm just making that up, and then they find an article you may have written on it, and then they're like, wow, they're smart, let's bring them into our company? Or are they already reading your columns? I don't really know where all the places other than your own blog that you might be. Are they finding your content without searching for it?
The answer is yes. It's a both and. Yeah, it's a both and. So search engine optimize for sure, but then also write compelling and hopefully insightful and title it in ways that are provocative and make people want to read. And so that's a both and. Some of your titles should do that. Some of them should work for the search engines if you're pursuing a content marketing strategy. But the most important element, once you're getting that click and somebody's opening it, is have something useful to say that they can go and apply right away and get some benefit from.
Yeah.
And if that's the case and you're adding value that way, it makes sense they're going to want to pick up the phone and say, hey, can you come and add this value in a more direct way?
What about your book? Your book lead to leads or not so much?
Here's what I'll say about books is I think there are different kinds. People write for different, you've written so many books. So, some are an expensive business card and that's the purpose they serve. Some are closers. And so I think of Winning Well in many ways as a closer. I've got it over my shoulder there. But for us, if we're talking to a senior level executive in an organization who's interested in getting some help for their leaders and their team, to give them Winning Well and show the thought leadership and to work through what all is there and that we really do know what we're talking about and that a publisher believed in it sufficiently and all that, that's a closer. And so when we have warm leads and we can get a copy of the book in their hand and say, hey, here are all the benefit statements in the table of contents and which of these look good for your people? Which ones do they need? And they're sitting there reading going, we need all of them. Okay, well, we can do all of them. Let's talk about your budget, and what's going to be most helpful for you. So
again, I hope everybody heard what you just said, like benefit statements in the table of contents. And I've never quite thought of my chapter titles in that way, but I'm going to start. I'm going to go and look at some of mine and be like, okay, that's an interesting thing.
If you're thinking of writing a book, for those of you that are authors out there, that's one of the things that I learned from Craig Valentine, who learned it from someone else. But it's one of the most valuable tools, I think, when it comes to writing a book is obviously the book's title needs to have something of value. It's provocative and there's a benefit, but the chapter titles, that's magic. And in the case of Winning Well, they can open the book and say, how to delegate so nothing falls through the cracks. Yeah, we need that. How to lead meetings that get results and people want to attend. Oh yeah, they definitely need that. And so if they're reading that going, yes, I want that, I need that, it should sell itself and hopefully whatever other work you do that comes with it.
Yeah, I like that. And I'm resisting the urge to go grab my own books off my shelf behind me to actually look. In the past, what I've tried to do is to write kind of like curiosity chapter titles, counterintuitive things, because in my mind, it was like, all right, the potential reader is on Amazon. They're going to get that look inside. And so they'll get 10 pages or 20 pages. including the table of contents.
That's right.
So I think I was always going at it, or often going at it, with some kind of like trying to be clever curiosity. But I think a hard benefit is pretty good advice.
Well, I think there's room for both. Like I've got your book right here, and definitely want to talk about it. Great leaders have no rules. And the first chapter is one that I would say is an example of what you just said. And it's also a concept that is near and dear to my heart. And I talk about quite often with leaders is close your open door policy.
Right.
Well, if I'm a leader or manager and I'm looking at this going, I'm curious about, well, what are these rules I need to not have? Close your open door. Well, what? Everybody says I have to have an open door policy. That's provocative. It creates curiosity. Absolutely. So I think that's a great strategy.
Maybe I need to make the next ones longer though, David. I got to close your open door policy to triple your productivity today.
Yeah. Close your open door policy to get the ideas you need to transform your team, whatever it might be. There it is. Yep. Yeah, that's that. Closing your open door policy is something we're talking about in our next book as well from a different angle. So I actually want to ask you about that in terms of great leaders have no rules. Can we switch gears and ask about
Yeah, sure. Let's just roll to it.
Well, let's talk about it. So great leaders have no rules. That's your newest book, Contrarian Leadership Principles to Transform Your Team and Business. Every author have to ask, like, why did you write this book? And you've written several, so why this one? Yeah,
this is one that it's been sitting with me for almost 20 years because the title, which is a chapter title as well, is a true story based off a true story where, and this is 20 something years ago. And I had sold my company and as part of the deal, I went and joined the bigger company reporting to the CEO. And he gave me this big talk trying to keep me engaged, of course, like, Kevin, I'm not your boss. We're partners and everybody gets one vote and we're going to build this company together. And that sounded great to me. And 30 days in, I got my first expense check back and it was short by like $4 or something. And I thought, well, it's not a lot of money, but maybe I filled out the form wrong. So I emailed the CFO and said, hey, seems like it's short a few bucks. Like, did I do something wrong? And he said, no. He says, we don't reimburse for Post-it notes. And I had bought Post-it notes, when I showed up for work, tried to reimburse the office supplies and they wouldn't do it. So I bumped in to my first rule that no one had mentioned, by the way.
Yep.
And, I emailed back, I'm like, why? And he emailed back and he says, wasteful expense. And so in that moment, how much of a partner did I feel like? How much of a VP did I feel like? How much of this being my company versus their company? And that was a very real lesson in that every time we bump into a rule, it takes away the opportunity for us to make a choice. And all of a sudden it becomes your company, not my company, or their company, quote unquote, not my company. And I immediately went to the CEO over this, and there this became the Post-it note battle in lore, because other people were like, yeah, they took off $3 because I had ordered a beer with my meal while I was out traveling on business, and they said you could have ordered a $6 milkshake, but not a $3 beer,
right?
And the CEO, Rudy, to his credit, when he heard that people were getting upset about this expense rule, he said, all right, fine. Everybody can buy Post-it notes. The rule's gone. But he said, Kevin, let me just explain what's going on. It's not about Post-it notes. He says, one of our corporate values is profitability. And that's kind of a weird value to have. But, he had a whole thing about, look, the purpose of life is not to breathe, but you better be breathing to go fulfill your purpose. And so he was very much about, like, we got to be profitable here. And he said, I used to go around the office and people would scribble little doodles on Post-it notes. They take phone messages on Post-it notes. He says, you know what I use? And he grabbed a stack of ragged paper, like printer paper that he had torn twice. So he had little squares. He says, doesn't cost anything. And that's what I doodle on. That's what I take phone messages on. So he said the Post-it note rule was a symbol of frugality. Now, even though he had abolished the rule because he didn't know it was bumming people out, because we had a conversation about it, rooted in our values, in the symbolism and what drove the culture, I never tried to submit Post-it notes again. I never bought Post-it notes because, I wanted to be part of the team. I wanted to be a member. I wanted to represent. But that's the difference. And so, the big example is like Netflix. They say freedom with accountability. It's not like you can just go do anything you want. But rather than have these rules, dress code, expense policy, all these rules, the fewer the rules, the better. But it doesn't mean everybody does what they want. It means we're having conversations about standards. What are the guardrails? What are our cultural standards? And if you're a knucklehead who buys ridiculous office supplies or 7 beers at dinner, okay, that's a coaching conversation. Maybe it's not quite a coaching conversation. You're going to get that feedback. But again, Netflix says about 3% of their employees seem to stray beyond the guardrails, but most people feel totally empowered, engaged, and enjoy that freedom.
Yeah, get that objective clear, and then release people to go after it in a way that makes sense. And I as an executive, I always used to tell my folks, listen, every policy that we have to create is a symbol of somebody's lack of common sense.
That's right.
Or not understanding. So let's fix that. Let's lead well. Let's get those things taken care of. And then you don't have to have as many policies and rules, because everybody knows what you're trying to achieve and you're going in that direction. And you can deal with the exceptions as opposed to trying to make a rule for every exception.
Yeah. And I think that's what it gets down to. And often the rules are put in place because one person, the exception, did something wrong. And instead of having a courageous conversation where you're talking to this person about it, it's like, well, wow, did you see how so-and-so was dressed on Friday? Okay, well, instead of talking to that person about they're not dressed professionally for work, let's just send a memo out next week to everybody. And then we run around, measuring whatever, shirt lines and whatever it is.
So much wasted energy. I call it the don't throw fish rule. And we talk about this in Winning Well, the idea, and this goes back to my education way back when. A lot of teachers will set up their classroom rules, and one of those rules will, we don't throw the balls at each other. And little Tommy, who's going to be an attorney someday, doesn't throw a ball, throws a block. And so, added to the rule list, don't throw balls, don't throw blocks. Little Tommy's going to be an attorney. He says, they didn't say anything about fish. And so now there's a don't throw fish rule, as opposed to, how about we treat everybody with respect and dignity? And
exactly.
If that's our objective and that's our culture, everything points to that.
Yeah. And when again, like the book title and the chapters are intentionally a bit contrarian and provocative, just because I'm trying to break through, and get some attention to the topic. And when it first started hitting social media, I would get a lot of not negative comments, but things like, no rules? Well, almost. I always say, you always have to be honest with me, or there's no line or something. And it's like, of course. But rather than telling your team members, you have to always be honest and never lie to me, how about have a conversation about integrity, and do we want integrity on this team, or what would it look like if we were to lie? Like, make it a conversation. If we co-create the standards, the guidelines, et cetera, we're far more likely to, follow them and not feel, again, like this is somebody else's team or family here.
Yeah, everybody has ownership.
Everybody has ownership. People will fight to protect what they helped to build. And so the more they can build those rules of the classroom, of the family, Dave, this is where people go really crazy, because I grew up, my dad was, so I grew up in the 70s in California. My sisters were older, always getting in trouble. So, he had curfews, he had all kinds of rules. And these always come from a good place. So he wants them home at 10 o'clock because he cares about them. But it becomes about the rule. It becomes about power. If they come home at 10:10, well, now, it's about respect. You not having any respect. It's a whole different thing. So I've got 3 teenagers, and I'm going to knock on wood, and they're good kids. I hope they stay that way. But I've never had a curfew, never had a rule. And it's not that they can go do whatever they want and that they're just running wild, but it's like when they say, Kevin, Dad, we want to go out late tonight, a high school party or whatever it is. I don't say be home at 11. I say, what time do you plan on being home? And remember, because I love you, I'm going to be staying up late worrying about you until you get home. And remember, I got to get up early to take your brother to basketball. And now what time would you like to come home? And then when they say 11, and usually they'll say something earlier than what I would have said, it's all fine, and then whether they come home on the minute or 5 or 10 minutes late, it's okay. We all were on the same page about it. So even at home, the more we can, with our spouses, with our kids, et cetera, co-create the environment, the better.
Well, I hope everybody was taking notes right there. It's such a good example. And you get at it like leadership is a relationship. Every relationship has those same fundamental tenets. Do we trust one another? Are we listening to one another? Is there that mutual respect? And so that act of co-creation you just described, so powerful for every aspect of our life. Love it.
Yeah. That word co-creation is becoming to mean more and more to me. Now, so I'm 52 and like, it's not a word I thought about even 5 years ago very much. And I wish it wasn't so important because I'm an introvert. I'm a driver. I hated team projects in school and I still hate team projects now. Like, I just want to do it myself. I wish it wasn't about co-creation, but it really is. I mean, if you want to create anything great, a great family, a great community, a great workplace, it's about co-creation and that's about relationship. It's just true.
It is the human condition. There's no way around it.
That's right.
Let's talk about what appears to be perhaps opposite. But so we've got that curiosity because this contrarian title, and I know where you're coming from, and I love it. But I definitely wanted you to get you to weigh in a little bit on this idea of closing your open door policy. What on earth are you talking about there?
Yeah. Again, I think there was a time where this obviously came from a good place. It's well intended. An open door policy is, facilitates communication, and you could even flat organization, leapfrog your boss, talk to anybody, get your ideas out there, solve problems, all good stuff. But the reality is very different. And, the obvious one is that the person being interrupted, and again, these days, it's not always a physical closed door. It's being interrupted with a Slack message or in an open office space, even with your headphones on, people tapping you on the shoulder. A lot of ways to break through that open door. It's impossible now to get the deep work done, the serious work done, getting into that flow state when you're constantly being interrupted. But that's the obvious part. Less obvious and maybe more important is there's research done showing that about half of the team members out there, they'll never go through the open door.
That's right.
Policy it's a passive communication policy, putting the burden on your team members. It's like, well, it ain't my fault the communication's not working. My door's open all the time. Everybody knows they can come in anytime. And whether it's through fear or not wanting to interrupt you or whatever it is, half the people will never come through that door. And then Marshall Goldsmith had a funny article about it. And he talks about the other half who is coming through your door all the time. And he says, all right, wait a minute. Why are so many people coming through your open door without a scheduled meeting? Did you hire the wrong people? Did you not give them any training? Or do you not have a climate of psychological safety where they feel like they can try to solve the problem? They can make a decision. No matter how you look at it, if people are coming through a lot, you're doing something wrong as the leader. So, I don't say like shut the open door and don't let people come in. I talk about close your door, open your calendar. So think about office hours, and to each their own. I mean, maybe your office hours are every day for 5 hours of the day, but you've got like the morning protected as your thinking time, your deep work time. Maybe office hours is the final hour of every day. Maybe it's only on Fridays. You can make whatever you want. But the idea is to send the message. I think it'd be healthy for everybody. Hey, okay, we're going to respect getting hard work done during these hours. So if possible, don't come barging through our closed doors, our headphones, or whatever it is. And then here's the time where we should be allowed to be interrupted. And I think more importantly, to make communication, more active from the seat of the leader, I'm just a huge fan of like the weekly one-on-one meetings, the team huddles. If you're in a fast growth organization, daily stand-ups. And those are things that no one's going to come through your open door if they know like, oh, you know what, it's Thursday, but I'm going to be sitting down with Kevin on Monday for half an hour anyway. Like this can wait. Or I got a quick question, but I know we're all huddling up for 15 minutes at 5 p.m. I'll just hold it until then. So to get that cadence of communication, consistent communication, I think that's a much better way to facilitate the same kind of communication.
Oh, without a doubt. And, there's something you said there I want to expand on a little bit that you said in passing, but I think it's important is that this idea of defining time for you as a leader to do the deep thinking work you need to do, that's not just for you. extend that to the whole team and to have that conversation that says, whatever works in your environment. Let's say, between 9:30 and 11 a.m. and then again, 2 to 3:30, that's our deep think time. And so everybody's in quotes, door is closed. You can interrupt that time under the following circumstances. If it's an emergency at this level, and this is what constitutes emergency, great. And, working with different managers who have been able to do that, it wasn't just controlling and helping themselves to be more productive. That helps everybody to be more effective.
Yeah, the behavioral psychologist Dan Ariely, had this article talking about, everyone's a little bit different, but most people, their cognitive abilities are strongest for about a 2-hour window at about 2 hours after we've woken up. So if you wake up at 6 a.m, from like 8 to 10 is kind of your prime time. And then the glucose starts getting burned up out of your brain, and we lose our ability to, make good decisions, to motivate ourselves, to have self-control and all the rest. And so a lot of CEOs, Jeff Bezos from Amazon talks about, if he has to make a big decision, he won't do it in an afternoon. He'll wait till the next day at 10 a.m. when he knows he's primed for that deep thinking.
Got all the faculties. Yep.
Yeah. So it just makes a lot of sense.
Too much sense not to do it. And yeah, so let's go back to the idea of the open door policy, though, just so that we're, if we've got anybody kind of new and going, gosh, what is this? The idea is not that you're not going to be approachable and that you don't want to hear. I mean, that's the good intention you mentioned behind the open door policy is, listen, you've got anything you need to bring to me, I'm all ears and I want you to come. And the door is always open. It's a philosophical door. Schedule with me, get with me, however that looks. To your point, that doesn't mean you're constantly interruptible. And I think that's the key thing if we're going to be productive and help our team to be productive. So yes, be open in that way. And then the other piece that is so vital, the best ideas are not going to walk through your door. So are you going after them? Are you going out and having the conversations? Are you creating the safety by asking the courageous questions? What's the number one thing that's getting in the way of us serving our customer? And when you ask that and actually actively listen, now you've created safety. People know you actually want an answer, not just, safe silence or ignoring it, whatnot. So,
yeah. I was going to say, and one more example of that, and it's often, you probably see the same thing, is people can really up their leadership game in the little things they're doing. And, someone was telling me just recently that his team dynamic changed dramatically when he used to go into meetings and be like thinking he was doing a good job and saying, all right, we've got this problem. How are we going to solve it? Someone says something. He's like, that's a great idea. How are we going to execute it? Let's do that. Well, he stopped and he said, now he always says he never takes the first idea, or at least not right away. So like, that's a great idea. What's another great idea? And what's another idea? And he also knows that, there's going to be introverts in the room or people that are newer on the team. And if David hasn't said anything, he'll say, David, what do you think? Do you have a different idea, or which of these ideas do you like? And it's only after like everybody in the room has weighed in one way or another, do they then grab something off that parking lot and start to work with it.
Well, that's great advice for everyone. Again, leaders at every level, I think we all need those reminders. And I certainly have had that happen myself. I remember working with an executive coach one time, and I was trying to get the diversity of opinion and get all the thoughts in the room. And we were getting to consensus too quickly for my taste sometimes. Everybody would rally around something and go. And a coach I was working with, she said, it's time to look in the mirror, David. How are you presenting the problem? How are you talking about the ideas? And yes, in those little things, it was clear I was favoring things. And even when I was asking for, give me the 5%, what could go wrong with this idea? Right. People weren't always comfortable sharing it. And it was up to me, the leader, to provide that. So what an important reminder for everybody. Like, gosh, if you're going to get the best ideas, it's up to you to get them.
That's right.
So that was the first chapter. I mean, we just had that was the first chapter of Great Leaders Have No Rules and all of the benefits that can come from that. We have limited time, but Kevin, there is one more that I really wanted to ask you about. I mean, there's so many good chapters in the book for everybody that's listening, but you talk about being real and showing weakness and as a leader, which I just think is so important. If you want their hearts to be connected, like you've got to show yours. And yet I think this is something a lot of leaders struggle with.
Yeah.
So I'm curious your take on what it means to be real or show weakness or things like that. I was just working with somebody an hour before this call who felt like they had shown some weakness and were eviscerated by some of their senior leaders. And so he was, where it may not have been a good place for him to be in the long term, but
right.
People have those fears. So talk to us a little bit about what that means from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, when I was in my 20s, early 30s, I had older executive mentors, tell me, Kevin, they would say things like leadership is acting, or they would say you can never share the bad news because you don't want people updating their resumes and looking for a job. So I was initially told, that, and this obviously comes from the old authority, command and control style, where you're leading through authority, you're leading through power. The military model was where this all came from. You want everybody like, we're going to win, all pumped up. But this day and age, I mean, people will not trust you if you are not authentic. They will not trust you if you're not transparent. And so trust, nothing happens without trust. They're not going to be engaged. They're not going to, so trust is paramount. And so authenticity, transparency is a driver of trust. For myself, I mean, I do struggle with, and in the book, I talked to, a Navy SEAL, former Navy SEAL commander as an example about, all right, so how much sharing is too much sharing? At what point do you cry in front of people? Do you tell them you're really scared and all that? And he says, Kevin, he said, you got to remember he said, first of all, you're transparent with all of the facts. So here's the situation. And if there's something bad about the situation, you do share that, because that's how people will help come up with a solution or be equipped to respond in the most appropriate way. And you'll build trust so that they're not going to think, well, what is he not telling me? Like the boss just said we're having a slow quarter. Does that mean we're all going to be laid off? As long as you're straight all the time, then they know it's no worse than what you're telling them. But what he said was it's the irrational fears as a Navy SEAL commander that's where he would draw the line. He said, we're all human. We all have emotions. Emotions aren't always triggered for logical reasons. Never really are, right? So he said, he would be honest and say, here are the orders. Here's how we're going to do it. And yes, this isn't quite the plan I would have picked. It's the plan we have, and we're going to make the most of it. And, you go forward with that. And I'm forgetting who taught me, someone on the show, or maybe it was like even I may have read it in Brene Brown's work, but it's talking about sharing with the people who have earned the right to hear it. So, hey, maybe if I've got a frontline team member who joined last week, I'm not going to open up about all my fears on the business or that we've only got 5 days of cash left in the bank or something. I might say, hey, we're all really focused right now on cash collections to, drive blah, blah, blah. But if I'm talking then alone with my business partner who I've known for 10 years, why wouldn't I be fully transparent? Like, geez, we only got 5 days cash in the bank. We got to come up with some ideas because I'm freaking out. So it's sort of like you can modulate your transparency. It's not lying. It's just sort of like, okay, realize you have different relationships with different people. Can they handle the truth? And again, that's part of your job to make sure they can. Early on, I was sharing my P&L with my young team members, but I hadn't fully trained them up in business acumen. And so
they didn't have the context to be able to understand.
So I would be like, whoa, we're killing it. We only lost $100,000. We were supposed to lose $1 million. So we're like way ahead of budget. And they're thinking, oh my God, we're losing money. So it was a different kind of thing. And I had to stop that until I really trained them into, P&Ls and accounting and all those things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, that's a great example of the modulation of transparency. On the one extreme, there's like this total stream of consciousness where you're just barfing everything that you're thinking or feeling, and that's not productive or helpful for anybody. And then at the other end, where you're this complete vault. And so,
right.
Yeah, with what have they earned the right to hear? Yeah. What are they ready for? And often that's a great developmental strategy too, is as somebody is growing to say, you know what, okay, it's time for them to hear a little more, and then let's put it in context and get them thinking about this. And that helps them to think more strategically as well. You hear so many leaders are like, my people won't think strategically. Well, are you giving them the information to think strategically and helping them, as you were talking about, having the context to do that?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And at the very least, making sure that we are our own, best versions of ourselves, not trying to be like another leader. I'm going to be like Jack Welch. I'm going to be like Bill Gates. I'm going to be like whoever, the big iconic leader is at the time. That never works. That never works. I mean, you really need to understand, what is your own personal mission, vision, values? What's your own leadership model? What's your have great self-awareness, personality, styles, whatever, and be the best version of who you are. Don't try to be someone you're not.
And having both the confidence in who you are and the humility to recognize you're not someone else. And I have so many stories about that, but I remember one of them was I wanted so badly to be the inspirational, the halftime speech giver type of motivational leader. And that, even from this podcast, probably understand that's not my personality. And when I tried, bless my heart, I tried, and it came across so weird and inauthentic, and I wasn't comfortable with it. It was horrible. Yeah. And so that, that being who you are and being authentic and being real, everybody connects with you better when you're that person. That's and you're not going to connect with everybody because you're not meant to. So that's okay.
That's right. That's right.
Fun stuff. So what was most of all the stories you share, Kevin, in the book, Great Leaders Have No Rules? I mean, if you only could pick one for somebody to walk away with and say, I just hope they'll remember this, what would be that story, that tool, that understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just go back to where we started, with the title. I mean, if there's one takeaway, it's realizing that rules imposed by you or the organization are getting in the way of engagement. And so, I mean, we can't most of us are not in a position where we can just go throw away the HR employee handbook or whatever it is. But within reason, I say, go back to your partner at home, go back to your kids, go back to your team and say, all right, let's talk about rules for a second here. Which ones bother you? Which ones are actually hurting our success, our productivity? Which ones are getting in the way of feeling like we're connected in the best way possible? Why do we think the rules were made to begin with? What would be maybe our standards or values that would be a better way to think about it? And David, I speak from, a lot of personal experience where, I ended up, divorcing my wife, or we broke up, and we didn't know it at the time, but I had started a business for 5 years, and I'm a serial entrepreneur, so she'd been there through a few of these beforehand. And she said, if you're going to start this business, well, then you got to come home every day at 5 to eat dinner with me and the kids. And you got to watch the kids afterwards, and you can't work on the weekends. And I readily accepted, because I'm like, I want to start this business, and fine, I'll do that. But it became about, we both thought the agreement was fine. And what it was about was controlling actions instead of outcomes. So I was there every day at 5 and at night and all the rest, but I was there physically. My mind was like, oh my gosh, there's so much work I got to do. Yeah. And I'm sitting here resentful, stacking blocks with the 1-year-old when I really need to work on that proposal or whatever it is. And we didn't know what we didn't know. And so, 4 or 5 years goes by, the business is a huge success. And as the business climbed up and I eventually sold it, within months, literally the marriage, we broke up. And looking back, we can both see that there was a way better way to handle that conversation early on. It goes back to conversation and co-creation. And what should have happened is we could have had a conversation about how important that business is to me and our shared values around certain wealth or whatever, and our shared values around a strong family and a strong marriage, and what might get in the way of that, and how could we hold on to that strength at a time of a lot of work. It would have been a whole different relationship and experience for those 5 years, but we didn't know. And so, I mean, it's going back to the very same thing we had touched on, but I encourage people is just to pause. What rules have you imposed on yourself in your own life? Maybe you haven't even thought about it, but oh, I would never I would never start a business unless this, or I would never date a person who does that, or whatever. Like, what are your rules for your own life? Self-leadership. What are your rules in your family or in your marriage? What are your rules for your team members at work? And is there a better way to get at what you're trying to get at, not through rules, but by a conversation that co-creates, some values and standards?
Boy, that is so powerful. And now you've really got me thinking about even the rules that you've created for yourself that are not necessarily helping you achieve the objective. And maybe you put them there for a good reason, but what is it you're really trying to achieve? What are you really trying to build? And what's the conversation even to have with yourself to help you?
That's right.
And the other thing I would have to call time out and point attention to it, Kevin, is as a leader, the act of transparency that you just shared with us, right, about your relationship and what happened there and the reality of that, that's a leadership move for everybody that's listening. And, if you were sharing that with your team at work or as a leader listening to this podcast, if you've got some, again, we're not dumping all over the place, but with people we can trust with a certain level of truth. But that was powerful. And it makes it that much more real. It's a strategic story to help us grasp what it is you're trying to get. So thank you for sharing.
I appreciate that, David. Thank you.
And where do we go from there?
I was going to say, I don't know how we go from there. Got a good joke or something? End on a high note?
Yeah, on a high note. That's how we went for the serious. Oh my goodness. It's not a joke per se, but I'm always curious, your people's earliest memory of themselves as a leader. If you were to think back, what is your earliest memory of yourself as a leader?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm gonna crib that for future interviews. And again, for myself, it would go back to sort of like self-leadership. And it was still a time when I was a teen, and I mentioned, I had older teen sisters who were getting involved in a lot of bad stuff, and I was going down that path. But there was, I won't get into the story again at this point. We'll do it for our next joint interview. But there was a point where all of a sudden, I went on the straight and narrow and said, all right, I've got a vision for my own life in the future. And I'm going to stop hanging around with these people. I'm going to stop doing these bad and sometimes illegal things. And, I ended up becoming a straight A student, became the first kid in my extended family to go to college, worked my way through college and all the rest. And again, at the time, I wouldn't have thought of it as leadership. But I realize now, so to me, leadership is influence. If you boil it down, it's influence. So it's how do you influence yourself? How do you influence others? It's really leadership nonetheless. And so for me, but it took this bad incident where I'm like, all right, I'm going down the wrong path. I can see that bad direction. I want this other direction. Now let's get some self-leadership and let's find ways to influence myself to stay on the straight and narrow. And when it came to people leadership, unfortunately, I was a horrible boss in my 20s. It took a while to understand that. So that came much later, but the self-leadership kicked in early. How about you?
Oh, I love that story, that self-leadership aspect. And by the way, yes, use that question. I ask every guest that question. It's just fascinating to see people's journeys. And for me, my earliest memory is 11 years old. I have this distinct memory. I'm the oldest of 6 kids. And one day in the backyard, every age group in our family, all 6 kids, were in the backyard with their group of friends. And so there was a swing set and a wading pool, and there were people in the pool, the younger kids, and the middle-aged kids were on the swing set. And then I had my older friends. We were throwing a frisbee around the yard. And there was this moment in time, and I kind of jokingly describe it as the universe kind of had a gong. And it's like the particles of dust paused in the sunlight. And it felt so good to have helped orchestrate and, as you said, influenced all of this activity to be happening simultaneously in the same space, but everybody was working. It was productive, as you can be when you're 11 or younger. And it was such a good feeling. And so that for me was, I think, one of my earliest memories of influencing, saying, hey, I helped make this happen. And this was fantastic. I should do more of this.
And I like using the word orchestrate. It's like an orchestra. You're not necessarily playing the instruments, but you're critical in making all that happen. This is great.
Yeah, very, very fun. Awesome.
So when are we going to do this again, David? Like check in with each other in 3-4 months, see how the year's going?
Absolutely. Well, we're looking for it. I know you're probably already thinking about your next book, and we've got another one coming up. Courageous Cultures is what we're working on next. And so it'd be fun.
When's it come out?
That one comes out in 2020. So we've got a ways to go for that one, but we're writing it. We're in the process right now. Manuscript's due in a few months. So
what's your writing process? Do you guys go like you do this chapter, I'll do that chapter, or how do you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Back to the co-authoring workshop, right? We will divide up the manuscript and each take chapters, and we try to do them at a week at a time if we can allocate the right amount of time where we're not out speaking or training and so on. And so like Karen will take chapter 4, I'll take chapter 5. We both write our drafts, and we have compost piles. So any ideas that we might have had that are relevant to that go into a file.
Neat.
And then the person has access to all of that, plus their thinking. They write it up, then we swap. And so the first thing you do the next week is edit what the person gave you, and then you're on to the next chapter you're responsible for.
Love it.
And so write a chapter, revise a chapter, write a chapter, revise a chapter, put it all together. And before you know it, you have a book.
Yeah, I like that. That's good to know. That's really good to know. Well, I tell the LEADx audience how they can find out more about your work and plug your podcast again, too, because obviously we got podcast listeners.
Absolutely. So first place to go is letsgrowleaders.com. And that's where you'll find access to all of the tools and resources that we have available for you. Lots of free downloads there to help you out. The blog you can subscribe for. And then also the podcast. So the best web address for the podcast is leadershipwithoutlosingyyoursoul.com. And you can listen there. You can subscribe just about everywhere you're going to find podcasts. And then Winning Well is the name of our book, and that's available on Amazon or anywhere you like to buy books.
Love that. Hopefully they'll go to all those places. And we, of course, will put the links in the show notes and articles and stuff.
Likewise. And now your turn. So for the Leadership Without Losing Your Soul audience, tell us about LEADx and where we can find your book and more about you and what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, the book, Great Leaders Have No Rules, bookstores, Amazon, anywhere books are sold, of course. The LEADx Leadership Show is the name of the podcast. And leadx.org is the company. And I'm not doing a lot of speaking or direct training these days, but we created something we call LEADx Coach Amanda, which is an AI-powered leadership coach.
So it is so cool, by the way. I mean, I've got to tell you, if you want to check this thing out, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's fun and it's raising a lot of eyebrows. I mean, I always say if you can afford a human coach, go get yourself a human coach. But for frontline managers that maybe don't have those resources, it's a great way to pick a leadership competency or behavior like accountability or giving recognition or whatever it might be. Amanda will give you a 12-item action plan. She'll buzz your phone, check in with you once a week, be your accountability buddy. And it's got a bunch of resources, personality assessments. So that's the main focus these days. I'm back in business tech startup mode for better or for worse. Some days it feels like it's for worse, but that's just part of startup life. So
that's the journey. But you have found that intersection of the startup life and the entrepreneurial and leadership, which I love how you have brought all that together. And what a phenomenal tool and resource to make available for folks.
Yeah, thanks. Well, until the next time, right, David?
Until next time.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. Friends, if you like this episode of the LEADx Leadership Podcast, please take a minute, leave a rating on iTunes or Stitcher. Ratings are invaluable for attracting new listeners. And I like to convert those listeners into leaders because, I'm on a mission to spark 100 million leaders in the next 10 years. And if you want to become the boss everyone fights to work for and nobody wants to leave, check out the LEADx platform with Coach Amanda at leadx.org. And if you have 10 or more managers who could use some binge-worthy training, send me an email at info@leadx.org, LEADx.org, and we'll talk about getting you set up with a totally free pilot for those managers. See if they like it. If they don't, that's fine. We go away. Part as friends. But if they love it, you've just found yourself a new resource for them. Remember, leadership is influence. You're always leading. How are you going to lead today?